Why did they do that? That's crazy. The entire leadership stepped down.
Yeah, I mean, like Alvaro, the vice president, and then the president of the Senate, who apparently is now trying to like sort of withdraw her resignation. So there's kind of I mean, again, I think that there's this problem with kind of the like Washington, like the U.S. media reaction. You know, the way that like this thing happens, like no one has any background on what's going on there. I'm trying to do this translation actually right now, like yesterday and today, on the like guerrilla group that Alvaro Garcia Linera was part of in the 90s, and like it's kind of a good background on like some of the forces that were behind the like wave that brought Evo into power. And several of those people then did split from the government and like have an oppositional position. So they're very like critical of Mas. But if you remember what I was saying a year ago, it was like, you know, where are these people going to be when there's a coup? Like, you know, if there's a fucking coup, like some block like that, like indigenous and people on the left are going to have to ally themselves, right? So I tried to look into, you know, what was the basis of those criticisms and like to what extent were they legitimate, or you know, I was much less positive about this kind of middle upper class, like you know, like sort of Western liberalism that is in the cities now. Um, that really doesn't seem like it would be there without the economic upsurge that's happened under Evo. Um, but I thought that one of the most useful criticisms that's a little bit like ironic in this situation, it came from like the indigenous groups in El Alto. They looked at how there was a petition from within the military officers to desegregate the two main military schools in Bolivia, which kind of has perpetuated like this two-tier, and it's it's racial segregation. I mean, it's like the dark-skinned and the light-skinned are the like you know officers that rise, and it's not like subtle, you know. And so all the signatories of that petition were just summarily discharged. So like these indigenistas, Cataristas, they're saying like if the Mas government was really like a movement towards socialism, like this would be like such a core battle to fight over, would be to like desegregate the military, because the military is a kind of long-standing, you know, conservative force. You know, you and I have talked about this a little bit, like the Che Guevara guerrilla. Like through the 20th century, there's like really fascinating Marxist politics in Bolivia, and it happens over and over again. And right after Che's death, there's another Teo Ponte, I think, like a year or two later. And if you watch the Soderbergh Che 2 about like his Bolivia diaries, there's kind of actually quite good historical information in there. The leader of the Bolivian Marxist party comes to the jungle, and they have like around the fire kind of a debate where he's telling the guerrilla like, this Che guy isn't even Bolivian, you know, like we're not going to support the guerrilla effort, which they definitely want the support. You know, it's like that city and countryside alliance is really important. And in the film, they have them respond, he's not Bolivian, but he's like Bolivar, like he's a Latin American, like he's for like liberation, and it's a kind of cool like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like you know, uh, but anyway, yeah, that was even in Che's diaries, that's really like the crucible of like why they lost, like they they didn't unite the country. So there's like these various attempts at creating that block, and then really it's this like EGTK, EGTK, like Ejercitio Guerrilla Tupacateri. That's the thing that Alvaro Garcia Linera was a part of in the 90s. So finally, there's this kind of like,
So who is he? Like,
he's a light skinned Marxist who, like, was living in Mexico City in the early 80s with Raquel Gutierrez, his partner, and they've split up, and she's now a critic of the regime. But they joined with this guy Felipe Quispe, and these like indigenous, and so they formed a pretty potent guerrilla force in the 90s, and they were defeated, but they had sort of carved forward like a path, like an alliance block, tactics with like the road blockades that eventually came forward. And Felipe Quispe is also an interesting figure where like when they arrested him after like doing these insurgent tactics, the cameras are right there, and he'd just been like beaten up and tortured and stuff. And they were like, "Why would you raise arms against Bolivia?" And he just like, without flinching, looks at the cameraman. And he says, "Because I don't want my child to carry your basket for you, or my daughter to clean your clothes." And like that sort of like just ensconced him in the public imaginary as like, just speaking like that is what's in Open Veins of Latin America. Like if you read that book by Galeano, it kind of makes a lot of these political questions like not that hard to understand. It's like these countries in the 20th century, Venezuela and Bolivia, are just oligarchies, like the peones, like the masses of these countries were just like peons, and it's sort of like a rich playground for oil barons and the extractivism basically. So there's like some more complex debates that were going on between, like, there's a woman named Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who's a kind of like world famous left intellectual from Bolivia, and she's a critic of MAS. They call it extractivismo. Like they're saying that like Evo was continuing this assault on the rainforest, and like they use Pachamama as a kind of like ideological screen, but really it's not an eco-friendly or like peasant-friendly thing. But then on the other hand, there are these massive campesino unions that he brought into the government, and now as people are freaking out and asking these questions of like where are those groups going to go, I think that the specter of that alliance becomes kind of important. So does that give somewhat of an overview?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Like, yeah, what happens now? Like, is something. I mean, even like with Chile right next door, all this stuff happening. Like, aren't people? Doesn't he have a pretty big base, or were people dissatisfied with him, or like disenchanted, so they're not willing to come out into the streets? So like, what is it like in the streets there now? Like,
I mean, that's a big question. There's like two stories, I mean, the Santa Cruz, like where the seat of like the wealthy light-skinned people for a long time, it's been like celebrations, and El Alto, there's definitely been a lot of chaos. But there was left criticism of him and dissatisfaction, but that's why I would kind of go back in time a bit to say that like I was there in 2018. I didn't really buy all of that criticism. I think some of it seemed like part of an important debate in like either protecting the regime or sort of like moving towards something further. But you bring up Chile, and it's like the region, it just seems like such an interconnected thing. These regimes seem to all fall in at once. And I'm not saying Evo and Piñera, I'm saying the way that the continent sort of swings left or swings right.
yeah, yeah. What? But I mean, was he losing or enough that he like? Because he won those other elections, he's been winning elections since 2006.
Yeah. Well, I think the question has always been like, if you get Evo out, are you going back to, the idea that you'd go back to the president that the revolution removed, that's just kind of a joke. So for these like, middle class critics in the cities, like, what were they when they're saying they want democracy and whatever their kind of complaints that really inconveniently congeal with like Washington rhetoric? What are they calling for? If not Carlos Mesa, like, is there anything on the horizon that would replace Evo? So I mean, that's a kind of unfortunate, like, almost a sort of like rightist defense of his regime, but that's why I think that these debates like deserve a lot more attention. People should be. Okay, hold on a second.
I'll message you.
Okay, Max, that's good.
Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
If you feel like it.
Yeah.
3 o'clock. 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Rock on over.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
And
Sounds good. Then.
Oh, you don't need to know that, but I'll come out Tuesday instead of Thursday.
Okay. Cool. Saturday sounds good though. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
See you then. But yeah, kind of like going back to some of those, these debates, and just like the history of the revolution, but I don't know. I mean, like, what's going on in Chile is amazing, and
is this is the guy who's going to be president now in Bolivia? Is he like a right, like a hard right, or is he kind of like soft right, or in the center? Is he promising to sort of dismantle the revolution, or is he just sort of bland centrist who may, just sort of slowly move it more towards neoliberalism, but isn't like going to attack?
I mean, they were just that class that he's a part of, and I don't know that he's going to become president, but he was the candidate for the last election. But that class of people that ruled Bolivia in the early 2000s, is just such like blatant corruption and cronyism. There's this way in which the 20th century revolutions didn't succeed because there was kind of this like good cop, bad cop hemming going on with reforms. And the revolution in 1952, that there was a lot of like Trotskyists and mining unions involved in that. That was like a huge event. And it almost went much further, but instead it was like the most important moment of agrarian reform. And so successive regimes sort of tried to roll back some of that agrarian reform, and then there were other moments where there was sort of like liberalization of rights and stuff. But the revolution that brought Evo in, it really was the first real break. It was an actual break with continuity, and you kind of, I don't know, the representational power of this, like the Argentine president said, a Bolivian who looks like Bolivians, the indigenous president. I don't think that is, people in the West don't have a fucking clue what that means. And there's also this like, recent racist rhetoric against Evo as like a cocolero, and he's like up in the presidential palace, like having these parties, like they should be spending that money on the people and stuff. And it's like, it's really hard. It's like, it's bullshit. I mean, like, they built a new presidential palace over, it's a tower, and it's kind of a cool building. They hired all these like indigenous artists to do the design and stuff. And the New York Times ran like a hit piece on how like this is like this emblem in La Paz of like their corruption, like this tower. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I was telling you how fucking awesome some of the infrastructure in La Paz is. That gondola system, the teleférico, is just like beautiful. It's like Aymara futurism,
Yeah.
And that's replacing like this square where Bertolina Sisi was like quartered. This is like the most like visible public heroes in the nation's history. Not even the nation, these are like the indigenous figures like Tupac Katari, Tupac Amaru, Bertolina Sisi. That that indigenous uprising in the 1700s, in the 1780s, if sorry, I'm losing my voice. If the mestizos and like people like Bolivar had given any support at that time, that would have been a successful anti-colonial liberation. But instead, there was never a question that they were trying to create a new colonial state, like the American Revolution, basically. So they participated in killing the Indias, and then you had the independence from Spain like a decade later, in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
But the memory of that, not just that betrayal, but just like these heroes being like tortured in the public square, she had her tongue cut out. That square is still the center of El Alto, so that's like a powerful kind of memory politics that exists there. And then there's this whole specter of like the Indios from El Alto like surrounding the city, being able to cut it off, and that the lighter skinned people in the city live in fear of this like perpetual blockade that can like kind of choke them off from the rest of the world. And so a lot of this is sort of like racially coded language, and yeah. I mean, he does coke in the palace. Like, you could read that either way. It's like, I would like to go to that party. Like, I don't, like my goal in going there was like, I've never done cocaine. I want to do it like really pure, without any toxins. Like if I could do that with.
Wait, did you do it?
No, didn't have the chance. I walked into the palace and like tried to ask my way upstairs. I was like, so, I'm just wondering if I could talk to the president or whatever. And they were just like, no, dude. Like, but I had a little bit better luck in some other places. I won't go in because like I'm kind of worried about people there right now. I'm not gonna like go into all the different groups. But